The courtroom was already suffocating before a single word was spoken. Rows of reporters filled every available seat, cameras poised, fingers hovering over record buttons. The air carried the low hum of anticipation, the kind that only gathers when history is about to be sealed by a verdict. At the center of it all stood Gao Taiyu, motionless, his face drained of expression as the judge prepared to deliver a sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. Life imprisonment without parole. For most trials, that moment would have been the end. A legal conclusion, a full stop. Justice, as the public understands it, would have been served. But what unfolded next transformed the courtroom from a place of judgment into something far more unsettling. Gao Taiyu did not remain silent. As the final words of the sentence echoed through the room, he leaned forward. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it drew instant attention. Cameras adjusted. Pens froze mid-sentence. What followed was not a plea, nor an appeal. It was a confession delivered with chilling clarity. He admitted to killing Yu Menglong, not in vague terms, not through implication or legal maneuvering. He confessed directly, deliberately, and without hesitation. The words did not come in a rush. They arrived measured, controlled, stripped of theatrics. It was as if Gao Taiyu had rehearsed this moment long before stepping into the courtroom. "I did it," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the faint clicking of camera shutters seemed intrusive. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire room had stopped breathing. Then came the sentence that would ignite global outrage. "Not because I hated him," Gao Taiyu continued, his voice steady, "but because I needed to erase everything that stood in my way." That single statement reframed the entire case. Until that moment, the public narrative had been simple: a powerful manager, a rising actor, a betrayal driven by greed, jealousy, or personal animosity. The kind of story that fits neatly into familiar true crime frameworks. But this was something else entirely. This was not the language of rage. It was the language of calculation. Within minutes, the confession spread beyond the walls of the courtroom. News alerts lit up phones across continents. Clips circulated online, dissected frame by frame. Hashtags demanding justice surged across platforms in multiple languages. Fans of Yu Menglong expressed grief and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the image of a beloved public figure with the brutality of his final moments. Yet even as outrage surged, a deeper unease settled in, because Gao Taiyu was not describing a crime born in the heat of the moment. He was describing a decision. As investigators would later confirm, the confession was not spontaneous. It aligned with evidence gathered over months. Surveillance records, financial documents, communication logs, each detail painted the outline of something far more disturbing than a single act of violence. What Gao Taiyu revealed was not merely how he killed Yu Menglong, but why he believed it was necessary. In his own words, Yu Menglong had become a threat, not a personal enemy, not a rival fueled by open hostility, but an obstacle, a variable that could not be controlled. This distinction mattered. Gao Taiyu had built his career behind the scenes, far from the spotlight that illuminated the stars he managed. To the public, he appeared disciplined, methodical, even unremarkable. But within the industry, he was known as someone who shaped careers with precision. Opportunities flowed through him. Access was granted or denied at his discretion. Influence, once accumulated, became invisible to those who benefited from it. Yu Menglong was different. His rise was rapid, organic, and increasingly independent. Each award, endorsement, and public appearance expanded his influence beyond the structures Gao Taiyu controlled. According to investigators, it was not success itself that triggered alarm, but autonomy. Yu Menglong no longer fit neatly into a system built on dependency. When Gao Taiyu spoke in court, he did not describe anger. He described inevitability. He was a threat, he said, not just to my career, to the life I wanted to control. This was the moment when the case crossed a threshold, because what we were witnessing was not simply a confession to murder. It was a revelation of mindset, a worldview where people were assets, relationships were tools, and elimination was an acceptable solution when control slipped away. For many watching, the immediate reaction was shock. For others, particularly those familiar with patterns of coercive power, the confession raised a more unsettling question. If this was the end, what came before it? Confessions often close stories. This one opened them. As analysts began to examine Gao Taiyu's words, a troubling realization emerged. He was not speaking like someone cornered by justice. He was speaking like someone explaining a system, a process, a sequence of steps that, in his mind, led logically to a single outcome. And that outcome did not begin with violence. It began with control. The courtroom had expected remorse or denial. Instead, it received a blueprint. And as the world focused on the shocking final act, we must ask the question that lingers beneath the headlines. If this confession marked the conclusion of a crime, what exactly had been unfolding in the shadows long before Yu Menglong lost his life? Because the truth, as it would soon become clear, was far more expansive than a single murder. It was the anatomy of a carefully constructed empire. Violence was never the first step. That was the most unsettling conclusion investigators reached as they began reconstructing the months leading up to Yu Menglong's death. The crime, when isolated, appeared sudden, swift, final, but the confession forced a deeper examination of everything that came before it. What emerged was not a timeline of rage, but a gradual tightening of control. Gao Taiyu did not operate like a predator who strikes without warning. He functioned like an architect, methodical, patient, focused not on destruction, but on structure. In his world, power was not exercised through force. It was exercised through access. We must understand this distinction. Those who worked with Gao Taiyu described him as calm, analytical, and highly attentive to detail. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely issued explicit commands. Instead, he positioned himself at critical junctions of decision-making. Schedules passed through him. Opportunities were filtered by him. Introductions, approvals, and strategic delays all originated from the same invisible center. At first, Yu Menglong benefited from this system. As his career accelerated, Gao Taiyu presented himself as a protector, a guide through the complexities of an industry defined by competition and exposure. He offered stability, structure, a sense of order in an environment that thrives on uncertainty. For a rising figure, this relationship appeared not only beneficial, but necessary. That was the first layer. Investigators later noted that control rarely announces itself as control. It presents itself as care, as expertise, as reliability. Over time, the boundaries between guidance and dependency begin to blur. Decisions that once belonged to the individual quietly shift into someone else's hands. According to court documents, this shift did not happen overnight. Gao Taiyu gradually became indispensable. Meetings were scheduled through him. Communications were routed through him. Conflicts were resolved by him. Even minor inconveniences were framed as problems only he could solve. What appeared outwardly as professional management slowly evolved into personal reliance. This was not accidental. Criminal psychologists reviewing the case emphasized that Gao Taiyu displayed a classic pattern of coercive control. Rather than isolating Yu Menglong abruptly, he introduced subtle disruptions into his existing support network. Missed calls, rescheduled meetings, conflicting information delivered to different parties. None of it dramatic enough to raise alarms, yet consistent enough to create confusion. Confusion, when sustained, becomes disorienting. Friends began to feel distant, though they could not articulate why. Assistants experienced miscommunications that strained trust. Colleagues sensed tension without a clear source. Each fracture, taken alone, seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a widening gap between Yu Menglong and those around him. And at the center of that gap stood Gao Taiyu. When questions arose, he provided explanations. When concerns surfaced, he offered reassurance. The very person engineering the isolation positioned himself as the solution to it. This dual role was crucial. It ensured that as Yu Menglong's world narrowed, the influence of Gao Taiyu expanded proportionally. Investigators later described this phase as the most critical, because by the time Yu Menglong began noticing irregularities, his ability to verify them independently had already been compromised. Trust, once centralized, becomes difficult to redistribute. Doubt lingers, but it lacks direction. Without confirmation, suspicion turns inward. Was he overthinking? Was this pressure simply the cost of success? According to testimony from those close to the case, Yu Menglong expressed unease in private. Not fear, unease. A sense that something was misaligned, yet impossible to pinpoint. He reportedly questioned changes in his schedule and the sudden cooling of certain relationships. What he did not question was Gao Taiyu's role in those changes. That, investigators concluded, was by design. Control does not require total obedience. It requires uncertainty. When individuals lose confidence in their own perceptions, they defer judgment to the figure who appears most composed. Gao Taiyu cultivated that composure relentlessly. In public, he remained measured. In private, he remained reassuring. There were no visible cracks. Behind the scenes, however, the system expanded. Court records revealed extensive monitoring of Yu Menglong's movements, travel itineraries, meeting times, patterns of behavior. This was not surveillance in the traditional sense. It was informational dominance. Gao Taiyu did not need to follow Yu Menglong everywhere. He simply needed to know where he would be and who would be present. This knowledge allowed for precision. Delays were timed. Interruptions were engineered. Opportunities for intervention were quietly eliminated. Each adjustment reinforced the same outcome. Yu Menglong increasingly found himself alone at critical moments, without realizing that those moments had been carefully curated. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not the sophistication of the methods, but their restraint. There were no threats, no overt intimidation, no explicit warnings. The environment itself became the weapon. By controlling context, Gao Taiyu controlled choice. By controlling choice, he controlled outcome. Experts later testified that this level of psychological manipulation borders on predatory intelligence. It requires a deep understanding of human behavior, trust formation, and social dependency. It also requires emotional detachment. Empathy, in such systems, becomes an obstacle. When Gao Taiyu described his actions in court, he did not frame them as cruelty. He framed them as necessity. From his perspective, Yu Menglong was no longer an individual, but a variable, a risk factor within a larger equation. His autonomy represented instability. His influence, left unchecked, threatened the architecture Gao Taiyu had constructed around himself. This reframing is essential to understanding the crime. The murder was not an eruption. It was a conclusion. By the time violence occurred, the groundwork had already been laid. The isolation, the dependency, the informational control, all of it ensured that when the final act unfolded, there would be minimal resistance, minimal witnesses, and minimal disruption. And yet, one question remained unanswered. If such a system required coordination, resources, and silence, could it truly have been sustained by one individual alone? As investigators began tracing financial records and professional connections, a more troubling possibility emerged. The architecture of control extended beyond a single relationship. It hinted at a network. Because systems like this do not thrive in isolation. They thrive in environments that reward silence, benefit from compliance, and overlook ethical erosion in exchange for profit or convenience. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that Gao Taiyu's influence did not end with Yu Menglong. It was embedded in the industry itself. And that realization would transform this case from a personal tragedy into a systemic reckoning. What Gao Taiyu revealed in court did more than explain a murder. It exposed a framework. As investigators followed the trails opened by his confession, they encountered patterns that could not be explained by a single individual acting alone. Financial movements did not align with personal necessity. Contractual shifts occurred with unusual timing. Decisions that appeared independent converged toward the same outcome. Each finding suggested coordination. Each confirmation widened the scope of the case. The first signals emerged from money. Transfers that once appeared routine began to look strategic when examined collectively. Rights to projects were reassigned shortly before key milestones. Shell entities surfaced with no clear operational purpose. Accounts connected to intermediaries received funds that could not be traced to legitimate services. Individually, these anomalies might have been dismissed as industry noise. Together, they formed a map. This was not merely theft or profiteering. It was preparation. Investigators concluded that Gao Taiyu had positioned himself to retain leverage regardless of outcome. If Yu Menglong continued rising, control would be maintained through contractual dependency. If he resisted, financial architecture was already in place to absorb the loss and redistribute value elsewhere. The system did not rely on one scenario. It accounted for multiple. Such redundancy is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of risk management more commonly associated with corporate structures than personal crimes. This realization forced authorities to reassess earlier assumptions. The case was no longer confined to intent and execution. It now required examination of environment, and the environment was cooperative. Media coverage became an early point of scrutiny. Several outlets had amplified narratives favorable to Gao Taiyu in the months preceding the murder. Reports minimized internal conflicts. Critical stories were delayed or quietly abandoned. While no single editorial decision proved misconduct, the aggregate effect was unmistakable. Public perception had been managed. Silence, investigators noted, is rarely neutral. In industries driven by access and reputation, silence can function as currency. Those who benefit from stability often avoid disrupting it. Questions that threaten profitable arrangements are discouraged, not through force, but through omission. Gao Taiyu did not need to instruct compliance. The structure rewarded it. This dynamic extended beyond media. Financial backers who had profited from projects linked to Yu Menglong found themselves under scrutiny. Some investments appeared insulated from risk in ways that suggested prior knowledge. Others were shielded by layered ownership designed to obscure accountability. None of this constituted proof of conspiracy on its own, but it established a pattern of mutual benefit. Systems persist when many parties gain from their continuation. When Gao Taiyu spoke of control, he did not describe isolation as an end. He described it as a kingship, anamis, and a condimmaus, a necessary state that allowed influence to flow unchallenged. Investigators now understood that this condition had been normalized across multiple relationships, not only with Yu Menglong. The confession, in this sense, functioned as an involuntary audit. As details became public, reactions shifted from shock to reckoning. Fans demanded accountability beyond the individual. Industry insiders expressed fear, not only of exposure, but of recognition. Many began revisiting past decisions, reconsidering moments when ethical concerns had been deferred for convenience. Public response intensified. Vigils honoring Yu Menglong transformed into calls for reform. Protests demanded transparency in talent management and financial oversight. Online movements documented patterns of manipulation reported by others who had worked within similar structures. The case resonated because it articulated a familiar unease. Many had felt pressure before. Few had seen its consequences laid bare. For Yu Menglong's family, these revelations offered little comfort. Justice, in the legal sense, had been delivered. Gao Taiyu would never regain freedom, but no sentence could restore what had been taken. Their public statements reflected restraint rather than triumph. Grief remained the dominant presence. Accountability did not erase loss, yet the broader implications could not be ignored. Legal analysts noted the unprecedented nature of the confession's impact. Rarely does a single admission unlock such extensive examination of an industry's internal mechanics. Gao Taiyu had not merely acknowledged guilt, he had explained methodology. In doing so, he rendered invisible processes visible. This visibility carried risk. Several investigations expanded as a result. Financial audits were initiated. Regulatory bodies reviewed practices previously considered standard. Contracts once accepted without question were re-examined for imbalance. None of this guaranteed reform, but it disrupted complacency. Criminal psychologists emphasized that cases like this do not emerge in isolation. They are facilitated by cultures that prioritize output over ethics, success over scrutiny. Gao Taiyu's actions were extreme, but the conditions that allowed them were familiar. Power, when concentrated, resists oversight. Unchecked authority does not always announce itself through violence. More often, it embeds itself in routine, in scheduling decisions, in access control, in who is heard and who is ignored. Over time, the absence of challenge becomes indistinguishable from normal operation. The tragedy of Yu Menglong forced that distinction into focus. As analysts reconstructed the final months of his life, they identified moments where intervention might have altered outcomes. But those moments were obscured by structure. By the time concerns became visible, pathways to address them had already narrowed. This is what makes the case endure. Not the spectacle of the crime, but the anatomy of the system behind it. The realization that harm can be engineered quietly, rationalized professionally, and executed efficiently within accepted norms. Gao Taiyu did not invent these mechanisms. He exploited them. The conclusion of the trial marked an end, but not closure. For the public, the case became a reference point, a cautionary tale about ambition untempered by accountability. For the industry, it posed uncomfortable questions about complicity and silence. For investigators, it demonstrated the value of scrutinizing structure alongside intent. Justice was served. But the more unsettling truth remains that justice arrived only after irreversible damage. The exposure of one empire does not guarantee the absence of others. Systems that reward control will continue to produce architects willing to exploit them. The story of Yu Mengelong's death will be remembered not solely for its brutality, but for what it revealed about the cost of unchecked power. It stands as evidence that crimes of this magnitude rarely belong to a single moment or a single person. They are built, and they endure until someone forces them into the light.